The most dangerous people are not the ones who think they are powerful. They are the ones who believe nobody can ever challenge them. On a cold Thursday evening in Manhattan, the dining room of the Sterling Room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and soft golden light. Politicians, executives, celebrities, and socialites filled the tables. Expensive conversations floated through the air alongside the scent of fresh bread and roasted salmon. Every detail was perfect, every smile carefully rehearsed, every guest accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted. Emily Parker moved quietly between the tables, carrying a silver tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. At 28 years old, she had learned that people rarely noticed waitresses unless something went wrong. She preferred it that way. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her uniform was spotless. Her expression remained calm as she delivered drinks and cleared plates with practiced precision. Most guests barely looked at her. Some offered polite thanks. Others acted as if she were invisible. Emily never seemed bothered. She simply did her job and moved on. Then the front doors opened. The atmosphere changed immediately. Several staff members exchanged nervous glances. A manager straightened his tie. Even a few regular guests turned toward the entrance. Victoria Hayes had arrived. Elegant, wealthy, famous. The wife of millionaire investor Richard Hayes. Her face appeared regularly in magazines beside stories about luxury charity events and exclusive galas. She carried herself like someone accustomed to admiration. A designer coat rested across her shoulders. Diamonds reflected the light with every movement. Two friends followed closely behind her. Victoria barely acknowledged anyone as she walked toward her reserved table near the center of the restaurant. The hostess greeted her warmly. Victoria offered only a brief nod before taking her seat. Emily noticed the reaction around the room. She had served Victoria before. The woman rarely left people feeling comfortable. 20 minutes later, Emily approached the table carrying sparkling water. Victoria was in the middle of describing a charity luncheon she had hosted earlier that week. Her friends listened attentively. Emily carefully placed a glass beside her. Before she could step away, Victoria looked down at the water and frowned. "This is not the brand I requested." Emily glanced at the label. "I apologize. I can replace it immediately." Victoria sighed dramatically, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Why is it always so difficult to find competent service? A few guests looked over. Emily remained calm. "I will bring the correct bottle right away." Victoria leaned back in her chair. Perhaps if people spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention, simple mistakes would not happen. Her friends laughed softly. The comment hung in the air. Sharp. Intentional. Several employees lowered their eyes. They had seen scenes like this before. Emily simply nodded. "I understand." Victoria seemed almost disappointed by the lack of reaction. She studied Emily for a moment, then smiled. Not warmly, not kindly. The kind of smile people use when they believe they have already won. "You know," Victoria said loudly, "some people are simply meant to serve while others are meant to lead." The nearby tables fell silent. Every employee within earshot froze. Emily looked directly at Victoria. Her blue eyes remained steady. No anger, no embarrassment, no fear, just quiet composure. Then she offered a polite smile. "I hope you enjoy your evening, ma'am." And with that, she turned and walked away. Behind her, the restaurant slowly returned to life. But something about the encounter lingered. Because for the first time all night, Victoria Hayes had met someone who refused to feel small. Most people believe strength reveals itself when someone fights back. Emily Parker had learned that true strength often looked like walking away. The restaurant gradually returned to its normal rhythm after the uncomfortable exchange. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked softly. Piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Yet among the staff, the tension remained. Several servers gathered briefly near the service station, exchanging looks of sympathy. One young waitress shook her head. "I do not know how you stay so calm." Emily placed a stack of menus onto a shelf and smiled gently. "Practice." The waitress frowned. "She was trying to embarrass you." Emily adjusted the cuff of her uniform. "Then it is probably a good thing she did not succeed." The answer left the young woman speechless. Emily returned to work before anyone could continue the conversation. That was another thing people often misunderstood about her. They assumed silence meant weakness. They assumed patience meant surrender. Emily knew better. Across the dining room, Victoria Hayes continued entertaining her friends. The story about the water bottle had already become another amusing anecdote in a long evening of self-congratulation. Every few minutes, she glanced toward Emily. The lack of reaction continued bothering her. People usually responded when Victoria pushed them. Some became defensive. Others became nervous. Many tried desperately to win her approval. Emily had done none of those things. It felt strangely unsatisfying. Victoria leaned closer to her companions. Did you see her expression? One friend laughed. There barely was one. Victoria frowned slightly. Exactly. The conversation moved on, but the thought remained. Meanwhile, Emily completed her shift responsibilities with the same steady focus she always carried. She remembered every table number, every special request, every allergy warning, every detail. Guests who treated her kindly received genuine warmth in return. Guests who ignored her received the same professional courtesy. There was no difference. Near 9 o'clock, a familiar customer entered the restaurant. An elderly man named Walter Benson. He visited every Thursday evening and always requested the same corner table. Emily greeted him immediately. Good evening, Mr. Benson. His face brightened. Emily, good to see you. She helped him settle into his chair before bringing his usual order without being asked. Across the room, Victoria had noticed the interaction. The elderly man looked genuinely happy to see a waitress. Not because of service, because of her. Minutes later, Walter accidentally dropped a folder beside his table. Papers scattered across the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Emily was already kneeling to help collect them. The old man smiled gratefully. You always rescue me. Emily laughed softly. Only from paperwork. Nearby guests smiled. The moment felt natural. Human. Something money could not manufacture. Victoria watched silently. For reasons she could not explain, the scene irritated her. Perhaps because respect seemed to follow Emily without effort. Perhaps because it looked authentic. By 10 o'clock, the restaurant began preparing for the late evening crowd. Victoria and her friends finally stood to leave. As she walked toward the exit, she paused beside the hostess station where Emily happened to be organizing reservations. The room grew quiet again. Victoria looked directly at her. You are very good at pretending things do not bother you. Emily met her gaze calmly. Some things matter more than pride. For a brief second, Victoria seemed caught off guard. Then she smiled dismissively. That sounds like something people tell themselves when they have no choice. Emily did not answer. She simply returned to her work. Victoria walked out into the Manhattan night, feeling strangely unsettled. And for the first time in years, she found herself thinking about a waitress long after leaving the room. By the following week, Victoria Hayes had completely returned to her normal routine. At least that was what she told herself. Her calendar remained full. Charity luncheons, magazine interviews, fundraising meetings, private dinners attended by people whose names regularly appeared in financial publications. From the outside, her life looked flawless. Every photograph captured elegance. Every article praised her generosity. Every social media post presented the image of a woman admired by everyone around her. Yet small moments kept interrupting the illusion. Sometimes she would remember the way Emily had calmly looked at her across the restaurant. Other times she would hear those simple words again. Some things matter more than pride. The sentence irritated her more than it should have. On Tuesday morning, Victoria sat inside the headquarters of the Hayes Family Foundation. The building occupied several floors of a glass tower overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Large photographs decorated the conference room walls. Smiling children, community projects, scholarship recipients. Every image reinforced the reputation Victoria had spent years building. Across the polished table, members of her staff reviewed plans for the foundation's biggest event of the year, the annual Hope Forward Gala. More than 500 guests were expected to attend. Business leaders, journalists, celebrities, politicians. The event would also include a prestigious humanitarian award. This year, Victoria herself was scheduled to receive it. The media response has been incredible, one assistant said. Several major outlets confirmed coverage. Victoria smiled. That sounded more familiar, more comfortable. Recognition was a language she understood. Excellent, she replied. Everything must be perfect. Around the table, employees nodded. Nobody challenged her. Nobody questioned her. They rarely did. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily Parker was finishing a morning shift at a small cafe where she worked part-time before reporting to the restaurant in the evening. Her life looked dramatically different. No photographers followed her. No interviews filled her schedule. Yet there was a quiet stability in her routine. Regular customers greeted her by name. Coworkers trusted her. Neighbors stopped to chat when they passed her on the sidewalk. Respect seemed to arrive naturally wherever she went. Not because of status, because of character. That afternoon, Emily arrived at the Sterling Room for another shift. The manager called a brief staff meeting before service began. "Good news," he announced. "Our restaurant has been selected to provide service for the Hope Forward Gala next month." Several employees reacted with excitement. The event was famous throughout New York. Emily listened quietly while reviewing the reservation list for the evening. "The guest list is impressive," another server said. "The Hayes Foundation hosts it every year." At the mention of the name, Emily briefly looked up. Nothing more. No visible reaction. The manager continued speaking. "Professionalism will be extremely important. We will be representing the restaurant at one of the city's highest-profile events." The meeting ended. Employees returned to work. Yet somewhere across Manhattan, two very different women were unknowingly moving toward the same evening. One believed her reputation was stronger than ever. The other had no idea she was about to step into the most important chapter of a story neither of them could yet see. And high above the city, hidden behind polished speeches and carefully managed headlines, the first small crack in a perfect public image had already begun to form. The city moved steadily toward the Hope Forward Gala while nobody noticed the quiet details gathering beneath the surface. 3 weeks passed. Advertisements appeared across Manhattan. Newspapers praised the foundation's charitable impact. Television hosts discussed the upcoming event. Everywhere Victoria Hayes looked, she saw confirmation of the image she had carefully built over the years. Elegant, generous, influential, untouchable. The attention felt reassuring. It always did. On the afternoon before the gala, Emily arrived at the convention center where hundreds of workers were preparing for the event. Massive crystal fixtures hung from the ceiling. Floral arrangements stretched across the ballroom. Technicians adjusted lighting while caterers organized serving stations. The room looked less like a charity fundraiser and more like an award ceremony. Emily tied on her apron and joined the restaurant team assigned to the event. Her responsibilities were simple: serve guests, maintain professionalism, help the evening run smoothly. Nothing more. Several hours later, while carrying a box of menus through a private hallway, she noticed a conference room door standing slightly open. Voices drifted into the corridor. Emily had no intention of listening. She simply continued walking until one sentence caught her attention. "The scholarship recipients still have not received the promised funding." She slowed instinctively. Inside the room sat several foundation employees reviewing documents. A woman near the end of the table looked concerned. "We postponed distribution twice already." Another man lowered his voice. "The board does not want questions before the gala." Emily remained outside the doorway for only a moment. She was not trying to eavesdrop. Yet something about the conversation felt strange. The foundation was famous for its scholarship programs. The issue sounded important. Before she could hear more, another employee approached from behind carrying equipment. Emily immediately continued down the hallway. The conversation disappeared behind her, but the words stayed in her mind. Later that evening, while setting tables inside the ballroom, she noticed several guests arriving early for private meetings. One of them was Walter Benson, the elderly customer from the restaurant. He recognized Emily immediately. "You are working here too?" he asked warmly. Emily smiled. "Looks that way." Walter glanced around the room before lowering his voice. "Interesting week for the foundation." Emily tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Walter seemed surprised. "You have not heard?" She shook her head. The elderly man hesitated. "Probably just rumors." He smiled politely and changed the subject. Yet his expression suggested otherwise. Throughout the evening, Emily noticed similar moments. Conversations ending abruptly when she approached. Nervous looks exchanged between board members. Small fragments of concern hidden beneath polished smiles. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to create questions. Meanwhile, Victoria moved confidently through the venue, overseeing final preparations. Reporters followed her. Photographers requested pictures. Staff members rushed to accommodate every request. She appeared completely in control. Yet unknown to her, the flawless image she planned to celebrate tomorrow was beginning to develop tiny cracks. Cracks almost nobody could see. Not yet. And as Emily stood beneath the glittering ballroom lights watching guests arrive, she had the strange feeling that the evening everyone expected was not the evening that was actually about to happen. The night of the Hope Forward Gala arrived beneath a clear Manhattan sky. Long lines of luxury vehicles moved steadily toward the convention center entrance, while photographers waited behind velvet barriers. Camera flashes illuminated the sidewalk. Reporters rehearsed introductions. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos stepped into the spotlight one after another. Inside, the ballroom looked magnificent. Thousands of crystal reflections shimmered across polished floors. Fresh flowers lined the stage. Large screens displayed images of charitable projects funded by the foundation. Everything appeared flawless, exactly as Victoria Hayes intended. Standing near the entrance, Victoria welcomed guests with practiced elegance. Her smile appeared in countless photographs. Journalists praised her dedication. Donors congratulated her on the foundation's success. Tonight would be the crowning moment of another remarkable year. At least that was the story everyone expected to celebrate. Across the ballroom, Emily Parker moved quietly among the tables carrying trays of sparkling water and appetizers. She focused on her work while observing the room around her. The atmosphere felt different from any event she had worked before. Beneath the polished smiles, an unusual tension seemed to linger. Small, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. Near one corner of the ballroom, two foundation employees spoke in hushed voices. Their expressions looked uneasy. Across the room, a board member repeatedly checked his phone. Several others appeared distracted despite the celebration. Emily noticed these details without fully understanding them. Then the program began. The lights dimmed. Guests took their seats. A video presentation highlighted years of charitable achievements. Applause filled the room. One speaker after another praised the foundation's impact. Scholarship programs, community outreach, educational opportunities. Every success story strengthened Victoria's public image. She sat near the stage glowing with confidence. Richard Hayes sat beside her, proud and attentive. Everything seemed to be unfolding exactly as planned. During a brief intermission, Emily delivered drinks to a private reception area behind the ballroom. As she entered, she immediately sensed something unusual. Several foundation representatives stood gathered around a table covered with documents. Their conversation stopped when she approached. Emily politely placed the drinks down and turned to leave. Then one sentence reached her ears. "If those families speak tonight, we are going to have a problem." She kept walking. Professional. Silent. Yet the words lingered. Families. Problem. The same uncomfortable feeling returned. Minutes later, she encountered Walter Benson near the ballroom entrance. The elderly man appeared more concerned than usual. "Interesting crowd tonight," he said quietly. Emily smiled politely. "That is one way to describe it." Walter glanced toward the stage. Sometimes people spend years building a reputation. Then one evening changes everything. Before Emily could respond, he simply nodded and walked away. The comment felt strange, almost like a warning. As the evening progressed, Victoria prepared for the highlight of the program, the humanitarian awards ceremony. Guests anticipated the announcement. Cameras positioned themselves near the stage. Reporters reviewed their notes. The atmosphere grew increasingly celebratory. Yet somewhere beneath the applause and admiration, uncertainty continued spreading through the room. Nobody could see the full picture yet. Nobody understood how the scattered fragments connected. But the foundation's carefully polished image was beginning to wobble. And while Victoria stood preparing to receive another standing ovation, the first real challenge to her reputation was already making its way toward the ballroom doors. The ballroom lights dimmed once again as the master of ceremonies returned to the stage. Hundreds of guests turned their attention forward. Camera operators adjusted their positions. Reporters prepared notebooks. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Victoria Hayes sat near the front row with perfect posture and a confident smile. Beside her, Richard Hayes applauded politely as the presenter began describing the recipient of the evening's highest honor. Every achievement sounded familiar. Every charitable initiative carried Victoria's name. Around the room, guests nodded in admiration. This was exactly how the evening was supposed to unfold. Then something unexpected happened. Near the rear entrance of the ballroom, a small group quietly entered the room. Most guests barely noticed them at first. They were not celebrities. They were not donors. They were ordinary people, parents, students, community members. Yet several board members immediately recognized them. Expressions changed. Smiles faded. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Emily noticed the shift while delivering drinks near the back of the room. The atmosphere suddenly felt heavier. One of the foundation executives stood abruptly and moved toward the newcomers. His calm expression appeared forced. The presenter on stage continued speaking, unaware of the growing tension. Meanwhile, several journalists began paying attention to the unusual activity. One reporter quietly left her seat and approached the group. Questions were exchanged. Documents appeared. Within minutes, whispers began moving through the ballroom. Soft at first, then louder. Victoria noticed the change immediately. She glanced toward the disturbance and frowned. Beside her, Richard looked equally confused. The presenter finally announced Victoria's name. Applause filled the room. Cameras focused on her. She rose gracefully and walked toward the stage. Yet something felt different now. The applause lacked its earlier energy. Too many people were looking elsewhere. Too many conversations continued despite the announcement. Victoria accepted the award and stepped toward the microphone. Her smile remained polished. Her voice remained confident. She thanked donors, volunteers, supporters. Then movement near the rear of the ballroom drew attention again. One of the parents who had entered moments earlier was now speaking with several reporters. More documents changed hands. Journalists began reviewing them immediately. Several faces showed visible surprise. Victoria noticed cameras slowly turning away from the stage. Her confidence wavered for the first time all evening. Emily watched from across the room. She still did not fully understand what was happening. Yet she recognized one important detail. Nobody was accusing anyone. Nobody was creating a scene. The truth seemed to be emerging on its own. Quietly, naturally. One reporter approached a foundation board member. Another spoke with a scholarship recipient. A third began making phone calls. The room filled with a new kind of energy. Not celebration. Investigation. Victoria attempted to continue her speech, but attention kept drifting away. Questions spread rapidly. Why had several scholarship funds been delayed? Why had recipients waited months for promised support? Why were families now presenting records that contradicted public statements? Nobody had answers yet. But for the first time, people were asking questions they had never asked before. Standing beneath the spotlight, Victoria felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The image she had spent years constructing suddenly seemed less solid than it had only an hour earlier. Across the ballroom, Emily quietly refilled a water glass for an elderly guest. She remained exactly where she had always been, serving others, saying little. Yet as the room slowly shifted around her, one thing became increasingly clear. The evening was no longer about an award. It was becoming about the truth. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Less than an hour earlier, guests had arrived expecting another flawless celebration. Now uncertainty moved from table to table faster than any speech could contain. Conversations grew quieter. Reporters became more active. Foundation executives exchanged nervous glances. The questions that had started as whispers were becoming impossible to ignore. Victoria Hayes remained on stage holding the crystal award that suddenly felt heavier than before. Her prepared remarks no longer seemed connected to the room around her. She attempted to continue speaking about service, compassion, and community impact, but every sentence felt less certain than the one before it. In the audience, several journalists were already comparing documents provided by scholarship recipients and their families. None of the information accused Victoria of anything illegal, yet it revealed something uncomfortable. Public promises had not always matched private results. Funding delays had gone unexplained. Families had struggled, while promotional campaigns celebrated achievements that had not yet reached them. The contradiction alone was enough to attract attention. Victoria noticed more cameras focusing on conversations in the crowd than on the stage. Her confidence began slipping. "There are details people do not understand," she said into the microphone. The statement was intended to reassure. Instead, it created more curiosity. Guests exchanged looks. A reporter immediately wrote down the quote. Near the rear of the ballroom, several scholarship recipients quietly shared their experiences. They were respectful, calm, honest. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody demanded attention. Yet their stories carried weight because they sounded genuine. Emily continued working nearby. She delivered coffee, cleared glasses, refilled water. She never joined the conversations, never offered opinions, never repeated the rumors spreading through the room. In fact, she actively avoided discussing any of it. Her focus remained exactly where it had always been: the guests, the service, the job in front of her. Walter Benson noticed this and smiled to himself. Some people reveal character when everything goes right. Others reveal character when everything around them starts falling apart. Across the ballroom, Victoria stepped away from the microphone and approached several reporters directly. She hoped a personal explanation would calm the situation. Instead, every answer seemed to generate another question. Why had certain announcements been made before funds reached recipients? Why had concerns from families remained unresolved for so long? Why had internal discussions about delays never appeared in public statements? Victoria grew increasingly frustrated. She was accustomed to controlling the narrative. Tonight, the narrative no longer belonged to her. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes sat quietly watching everything unfold. He had spent years trusting reports, presentations, and public summaries. Until now, he had never looked closely at the details. As conversations continued around him, he began noticing something unexpected. Nobody was criticizing Emily. Nobody was even talking about her. Yet somehow she stood in sharp contrast to everything happening in the room. One woman possessed wealth, influence, and recognition. The other possessed none of those things. Yet only one seemed completely at peace. Near midnight, Victoria glanced across the ballroom and spotted Emily serving drinks at a nearby table. Their eyes met briefly. Emily showed no satisfaction, no judgment, no triumph. Only the same calm professionalism she had shown from the beginning. For reasons Victoria could not explain, that bothered her more than the reporters, more than the questions, more than the fading applause. Because deep down, she was beginning to understand a painful truth. The woman she had tried to make feel small had never been competing with her in the first place. And as the evening continued unraveling around them, that realization became impossible to ignore. The gala ended later than anyone expected. Guests lingered in small groups throughout the ballroom, discussing documents, unanswered questions, and conversations that had completely overshadowed the award ceremony. The crystal lights still sparkled overhead, but the mood had changed. What began as a celebration had become a night of reflection. Richard Hayes remained seated long after many guests had left. For years he had trusted the image surrounding the foundation. Reports arrived on his desk. Updates were presented at meetings. Public events showcased success after success. He had never questioned the larger picture because he believed the people around him were managing it responsibly. Tonight was different. For the first time, he listened directly to the families. He listened to scholarship recipients. He listened to staff members whose concerns had never reached him. The more he listened, the quieter he became. Across the ballroom, Victoria sat alone at a table near the stage. The award rested beside her untouched. Earlier that evening it had symbolized recognition. Now it felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Several people she considered friends had already left. Others avoided eye contact. Nobody accused her directly. Nobody raised their voice. Yet the absence of admiration felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. For perhaps the first time in years, she could not control how people saw her. Meanwhile, Emily continued helping the event staff clear tables and organize supplies. Her shift had technically ended, but she stayed to assist the team. She folded linens, carried trays, helped stack equipment. The same simple tasks she performed every day. One of the younger servers approached her. "Can you believe everything that happened tonight?" Emily placed a stack of menus into a storage cart. "A lot happened. Everybody is talking about it." Emily nodded politely. People usually do after a long evening. The server looked puzzled. "You are surprisingly calm." Emily smiled softly. "Some things take time to understand." Nearby, Richard happened to overhear the exchange. He watched her for a moment. The contrast struck him once again. While powerful people worried about headlines, public perception, and damaged reputations, the waitress everyone overlooked seemed focused on helping others finish their work. Eventually he approached her. "Emily." She turned. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes." Richard hesitated before speaking. "I think I owe you an apology." Emily appeared genuinely surprised. "For what?" Richard glanced across the room toward Victoria. "For not paying attention sooner." Emily followed his gaze briefly before looking back at him. Sometimes people only see what they are ready to see. The answer stayed with him. No bitterness. No accusation. Just honesty. Richard nodded slowly. As the final guests departed and workers began dimming the ballroom lights, he realized the most important lesson of the evening had not come from a speech or an award. It had come from observing two very different people respond to the same situation. One fought desperately to protect an image. The other never needed one. And somewhere in the quiet hours after midnight, while Manhattan continued shining beyond the ballroom windows, Richard Hayes began understanding the difference between being admired and being respected. 3 weeks later, Manhattan had largely moved on to new headlines. The reporters who once filled the ballroom had found other stories to chase. The photographers had moved on to other events. The noise had faded. What remained was reality. The Hayes Foundation had begun a thorough review of its programs. Delayed scholarship funds were finally reaching the students who had waited for them. Internal processes were being corrected. Promises were being matched with action. Richard Hayes spent more time listening than speaking. The experience had changed him. He attended meetings he once delegated. He asked questions he had never thought to ask before. Most importantly, he stopped assuming that a polished presentation always reflected the truth. Victoria Hayes withdrew from the public spotlight for a while. The magazines that once featured her every month no longer called as often. Invitations arrived less frequently. At first, she blamed the reporters, then the board members, then the circumstances. But as the weeks passed, another realization slowly emerged. The image she had spent years protecting had become more important to her than the people it was supposed to serve. It was not a lesson she enjoyed learning, yet it was one she could no longer avoid. Across the city, Emily Parker continued living exactly as she had before. Every morning, she greeted regular customers at the cafe. Every evening, she worked at the Sterling Room. She remembered names, carried trays, helped coworkers, solved small problems before they became larger ones. To most people, nothing about her life appeared remarkable. Yet those who knew her best understood something different. Respect followed her because she offered it freely. One rainy Thursday evening, Walter Benson arrived for dinner as usual. Emily greeted him with a smile and brought his favorite table by the window. As she set down his coffee, Walter chuckled softly. "You know, half the city spent weeks talking about that gala." Emily laughed. "People enjoy a good story." Walter nodded. "And yet you never told anyone your side of it." Emily looked out the window where rain traced gentle lines across the glass. There was no side to tell. "Really?" Walter asked. She smiled. The truth already knew where to go. The old man sat quietly for a moment before shaking his head in admiration. Nearby, another customer who had overheard the conversation looked curious. "If someone treated me the way she treated you," he said, "I would have wanted revenge." Emily considered the statement carefully. Then she folded a napkin and placed it neatly beside a plate. Revenge keeps your attention on the person who hurt you. The restaurant grew strangely quiet around her. "I would rather spend my attention on becoming the person I want to be." Nobody spoke for several seconds. The answer settled over the room with surprising weight. Later that night, as the last guests left and the city lights reflected across the wet streets outside, Emily locked the restaurant door and began walking home. She was still a waitress. She still lived in the same apartment. She still woke up early every morning. Yet somewhere along the way, people had learned something important from watching her. Status can attract attention. Wealth can create influence. Reputation can fill a room. But dignity survives long after all three disappear. And sometimes the loudest victory is not exposing someone else's weakness. It is quietly refusing to lose yourself while the truth finds its own voice.